Welcome back to part 2 of RGES High School Grammar, Lesson 14. We're talking about the 4 kinds of sentences. Now, when we're talking about complex sentences, we've been defining it here as a main clause and one or more subordinate clauses. So as we've analyzing the structure of this sentence, we see that, again, in the red, we have the main clause, Lucentio decided to woo Bianca instead. Now, what about what comes before? Although he came to study at the university. Notice that is not an independent clause. It is a clause. It has a subject and a verb, but it cannot stand alone. It does not make complete sense or a complete thought by itself. So that is a subordinate clause, and I've outlined it in green this time. So my main clause is bracketed in red, and my subordinate clause is bracketed in green. How I would punctuate it is going to depend upon the location. The comma rule is based on the position of the subordinate clause. If it's at the beginning, as it is here, although he came to study at the university, you would put a comma after it. If it were in the middle of the sentence, let's say I switched it and I said Lucentio, although he came to study at the university, decided to woo Bianca instead. If I'm inserting that subordinate clause in the middle of the sentence, I would have commas on both sides of it. And then if I put it instead at the end, let's say I wanted to write a sentence that said, Lucentio decided to woo Bianca instead, although he came to study at the university. And notice position just emphasizes something different each time, and sometimes the differences are very subtle or almost not noticeable as far as meaning goes. But if I positioned it at the end, there would be no comma. At the beginning, a comma after the subordinate clause. In the middle, a comma around the subordinating clause. And at the end, no comma. And several of you made that mistake even as you were writing your examples. So make sure you understand that idea. Now, moving on to then our 4th kind of sentence here. The compound complex sentence has the definition is it has at least 2 main clauses and at least 1 subordinate clause. So let's analyze this sentence. After he buried his father, Petruchio decided he needed a rich bride, for his father had left him with many debts. Okay, so we're going to look at each clause. The first clause, after he buried his father, is it dependent or independent? And we're identifying our clauses by a subject and verb. He buried. So the whole clause is, after he buried his father. It is a dependent clause. It cannot stand by itself. We'll bracket it in green, and because it's positioned at the beginning of the sentence, we'll put a comma after it. The next clause, we're looking for another subject-verb pair. Petruchio decided. Petruchio decided he needed a rich bride. Our second clause. Could it stand alone? Could I just make that a sentence? Yes. So this is an independent clause. We've bracketed it in red, showing that it's independent, and we've numbered it number 1. Next clause. Father had left. We're looking for subject-verb pairs. Reading the whole clause. His father had left him with many debts. Now, I'm not reading the coordinating conjunction when I analyze whether or not that's an independent clause or a dependent clause. I'm just reading from his father. Got it? His father had left him with many debts. That could stand alone in the sentence. So we're going to call that the second main clause or the second independent clause. So this sentence has 2 independent clauses, both bracketed in red, and 1 dependent clause at the beginning, bracketed in green. Now, we've already discussed the comma after the dependent clause. Let's look at how we joined the 2 independent clauses. We joined it with this right here. We've got a comma 4. That's a comma and a coordinating conjunction to join the 2 independent clauses. So you notice now we're using two of the comma rules. One on how to join a dependent clause to an independent clause, and another one for how to join the two independent clauses together. Make sure all this makes good sense to you. What are you to know? Make sure you can define each type of sentence. Number one, all four of these sentences, define them in terms of clauses. 2, how to identify each main clause and each subordinate clause. I would want you to be able to bracket them and label them independent or dependent. 3, I want you to know the reason for every comma that is being used for sentence structure. There are other reasons we would use commas, but right now we're talking about using a comma to break up independent clauses and dependent clauses and when you need them. And for what type of sentences is, if I gave you a sentence, you would want to be able to break it up into the clauses, label each clause, and tell me what kind of sentence it is. Okay, now make sure you do come to class this week with your worksheet done, and there are a couple more ideas I'll work on the next page to show you for your worksheet here. Now notice what I have here. I've made these sentences small so that you don't miss what we're saying, but we could have made each independent clause, much more complicated, okay? But right now I have 3 very simple independent clauses. Lucentio tutored, Hortensio played his lute, Petruchio wooed the shrew. What if I wanted to combine all of these together? That's a period at the end there. What if I were to combine 3 ideas that I considered close enough, and often when they're small like this would be when you would choose to. I could either do this by, notice I have no subordinate clauses, so this is going to be a compound sentence. Okay. I could do it like this. I could say, Lucentio tutored, comma, Hortensio played his lute, comma, and Petruchio wooed the shrew. And in this case, I have like a list, 1, comma, 2, comma, and 3. Like that, period. I could also do this if I wanted to emphasize the Petruchio is doing something, the others are subordinate to him. This is still a compound sentence, but I could have done this a second way. I could have, let's pick another color here. I could have said, Lucentio tutored, comma, and Hortensio played his lute, comma, while Petruchio wooed the shrew. And now what have I done? This is not one of my 7. So in this first case, I have a compound sentence. But when I say, while Petruchio wooed the shrew, I have now introduced, remember I had you memorize the 7 coordinating conjunctions. What are they? And, but, for, nor, or, so, and yet. This is not one of those. So this now subordinates this last clause and converts it into 2 independent clauses and a subordinate clause. So that would be a 2 and 1. That would be a compound complex sentence. So compound in the first case, or compound complex in the second case. So we have some choices when we have 3 clauses. But I asked you, there's the 1, 2, and 3. But I asked you, how would I combine them if they were all independent clauses? So I would not do it that way. I would do it this way and make it a compound sentence. Okay. Now, let's talk a moment about fragments and run-on sentences. A fragment is a part of a sentence that has been disjoined or cut away from the main clause. In other words, how did I cut it away? By putting a period and letting it stand by itself. It may be a dependent clause, or it could be any other kind of phrase that cannot stand by itself. For instance, let's say I said, the old man fell asleep while reading the story. That sounds perfectly good when I read it orally. The old man fell asleep while reading the story. The problem is some students will do this. They will write it this way. The old man fell asleep, period, capital, while reading the story, period. That's a fragment right there. It has been cut off. All these words would have been perfectly fine together had you not made it into 2 sentences. And much of your writing has fragments in it. You put the period too soon. Usually you correct a fragment by just letting it continue as part of the previous sentence. What we really have here is the old man fell asleep, independent clause, while reading the story, dependent clause, coming after words at the end of the sentence, so I should have no comma, no nothing, right? Just continue on without a capital. Change that to a small letter and put your period at the end. And that's all you have to do usually to fix a fragment, is decide which sentence is it really a part of. Run-on sentences. Run-on sentences is where you are failing to put periods. You just continue on and on. So a fragment is where you're putting too many periods. A run-on sentence is where you are going, you are writing along and you fail to identify when one sentence stops and another begins. Let's analyze this sentence. The small boy tripped over the pavement. The small boy tripped on the pavement. He skinned his knee and began to cry while his mother came running out to help, but soon he was comforted. We have too many ideas being joined. Let's look at how many clauses we have. The small boy tripped on the pavement. He skinned his knee and began to cry. These are both independent and dependent. While his mother came running out to help, but soon he was comforted. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 clauses here. And this is way too much to join together. You want to join into a single sentence things that are very closely linked. And if your writing is kind of looking like this and you get RO over in the side, it means you're paying no attention to sentence structure. You are just writing your ideas out, flowing your ideas out, which is fine in a rough draft. But then you must go back and decide where each independent thought exists and deliberately join them, but you never want to join 4 ideas like that. This is becoming very convoluted, especially when they start shifting gears. Okay, it makes it very difficult for a reader to follow what you're saying. And so these are run-on sentences, taking way too many ideas or too many ideas, even one too many idea, and combining them together when they need really to be different sentences. So that's enough. Go ahead and finish out your worksheet. Again, you will not be responsible. I will tape the Shakespeare worksheet tomorrow, or Shakespeare lecture on performance tomorrow, but you will not be responsible to have those notes until the following week.